Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're deploying a Django and React application on Render. This is not the first video in this series, we've already done one before in which I explain the architecture of the deployment, including the app that we're going to be deploying and the costs and dependencies. In this video we're going to continue and we're going to be changing our Django backend code for the deployment. And when we take a look at the overall architecture, then you can see in the red box that that is actually the part that we will be focusing on today. We'll be making some changes to our local project, specifically the backend folder, to make sure that everything is ready for the actual deployment. Now, to complete that, we're going to be following 7 steps. We're going to start by installing some additional packages that we will need to deploy our app. Then we're going to be creating a separate settings.py file for the deployment because some of the things when we deploy are going to be a little bit different than what we would like to do in our local computer. Then we're going to tell our application when to use what settings, and we're going to be generating a requirements.txt file that lists all of the packages that we've used during development. Then we're going to add 2 more files, which is a build file for render and a git ignore file so that we don't take all of the files that we use to GitHub. And as a last step, we're going to be making sure that our project still works on our local computer. Now, before we get started, I want to put your attention to the documentation that Render provides, because in there you can actually read up on all of the details of deploying a Django app on Render. It lists down some of the steps of deploying your Django application, and I've actually picked up different parts of this to help me with deploying this as well. And I will put this link to the documentation also in the description. So let's get started and install some new packages inside of the project that we will be deploying. Now, the first package that we need to install is PsycopG2. And this is going to help us with the new database that we're going to be using. Because in our local project, we currently use a SQLite database, but when we deploy the app, we need to use a PostgreSQL database, because that's simply the best way to go. Now, this package, the PsycopG2 package, will help us with making sure that Django can communicate with the PostgreSQL database. So it's kind of an adapter between our Django code and the actual database. So what we will do is we're going to copy over this command of pip install psycopg2 and then install it inside of our project. So right now we're inside of our project and we're going to be opening a new terminal. And all of the changes that we're going to be making in this video are going to be in our backend folder. So I'm going to cd into the backend. Now, I'm using a virtual environment which stores all of the packages that I use during the development. So we also need to activate that. So I do venv/scripts/activate, and you can see on the front now that our virtual environment is ready to be used. Now in here, we will be installing this package of PsycopG2. So we do that with Python -m and then pip install PsycopG2. And this is now complete. The second package that we need is DJ database URL. And this package is going to help us with listing environment variables as our database credentials. And you will see later on how we will use this to specify what database we will be using during the deployment. So same thing here, we're going to copy over this pip install. And inside of our project, we do Python -m and then pip install DJ database URL. The next package is white noise. And if you've deployed a Django application before, you will be quite familiar with this package. This is going to make sure that static files can be handled during the deployment. So same here, we copy over the pip install white noise. And inside of our project, we do Python -m and then pip install white noise. The next package we need is gunicorn, and gunicorn is actually the package that will make sure that our app can run inside of the render environment. And all we need to do here is again copy it over and follow the same steps, which is Python -m and then do pip install gunicorn. Now in the documentation, Render describes that we need some additional packages to make sure that everything runs correctly, and that is uvicorn, which serves as an ASGI web server. So this again is going to make sure that your application runs fine on Render. You don't need to know too much about this. we're just going to copy this over and make sure it's included by doing Python-m and then pip install uvcorn. And now our first step is complete because all of the packages have been installed. The second step is making some changes to our project settings. Now the first thing that we need to do is make a change to our current settings. And our settings are located in the API folder inside of the backend and then in our settings.py file. Now the thing that we have currently not defined in here is the static root. And this is going to tell us where static files in the end need to be stored. So in this file, we're going to scroll down a little bit and we can put the static root somewhere around here. I don't think it matters that much. So we say static underscore root. And this variable is going to be equal to base underscore dir, which means base directory, and then slash static files. And static files actually needs to be between parentheses. Now, what this does, it is going to specify that later on, when we are going to collect all of the static files that are being used by our application, is going to store those in the base directory and then in a folder called static files. So it's letting our app know where this is going to land. Now, our base dir or our base directory is already defined by default on the top, which is just the highest level of our application, which will be in the backend folder. And then we say, well, just go to a new folder called static files, and in there you can drop all of the folders. Now you will notice in our settings.py file that there are quite some settings which are going to be specific to our local computer. Because some of the examples is that we have a database right here, which is the SQLite database. But when we deploy this, we're going to be using a PostgreSQL database. So we need to change this setting because it's not going to work otherwise. Another thing that you will also notice is that the secret key is just completely available right here. And we want to keep this a secret for safety reasons. And also the debug setting right here should always be set to false. And it even explains that in the text right here, you should never run with debug turned on in production. Now, I want to use this application on my local computer, but I also want to use it when we have it on render. So to realize that, we can create a new settings file and specify in there what settings are going to be different in our deployment opposed to when we run it on our local computer. So what we do is inside of the API folder or in the folder where your settings file is currently in, we add a new file called deployment underscore settings.py. And in here, we're going to list everything that is going to be different opposed to our settings.py file. Now in here, we start with a few imports. First off, we import OS because that's what we're going to need to refer to environment variables. Then we're also going to import a package that we have just installed, which is dj underscore database underscore URL. And that's going to help us when we define the database credentials. Then we're going to say that from.settings, we want to import everything because we still want to have all of the settings from this file that we're actually not going to overwrite. And then we can do also from.settings and import base dir, because for some reason it only works when you do it this way, or at least that was my experience in the previous deployment, and since then I always import it separately there as well. Now the first thing that we need to define in this file is the allowed hosts. And if we go to the Django documentation, you can see that allowed host refers to the domain name that the Django site can serve. So we need to let it know that when we are on render, that the URL that render proposes can actually communicate with our code. And that is for safety purposes. But you might think we don't even know the URL yet that render is going to give us. So how are we ever going to be putting that inside of our settings? Well, luckily render has thought about that. So we can do allowed hosts, and we can set this to an environment variable that render is going to define by default. So we do os.environ and then .get. And in there we do some square brackets, and we can refer to something called render underscore external underscore hostname. Now, when we deploy our application, this environment variable that render is going to set automatically is going to contain the domain name of the application. So by setting it to this, it will work and it will make sure that our application can run. Now, the next variable that we are going to set is CSRF underscore trusted underscore origins. And again, this is one of those settings that is going to make sure that our app is secure. Now, if we take a look at the Django documentation, we can see that this setting wants to have a list of the trusted origins for unsafe requests, such as post requests. So we need to list down again the URL of our backend to let our application know that that one can actually make post requests. So this is also a little bit about security of the database. Now in here, we need to provide the same value again because we need to provide the domain name, but this time with a little bit of an extension. So we start off with some text value, which is HTTPS and then a colon and then // and then we do a plus sign and then refer to os.environ.get to the same one that we used before, which is the render underscore external underscore hostname. So this is just going to paste those two together and make sure that this is the trusted origin for making post requests. Now the next one is debug, and this needs to be equal to false, because when we leave this to true and we have an error inside of our application, that actually shows a lot of sensitive information that we don't want anyone to see. So we are going to set that to false to make sure that there's no information leaking from our app. The next one we also need to do is the secret key, because we also want to keep that one as a secret. And we're going to set this to os.environ.get and then some square brackets, and then we give it the name of secret underscore key. Now we're going to be defining this secret key later on inside of render so that we have a secure value over there. So you don't need to worry about this right now, just give it this name and then later on we will make sure that this is in order. The next thing that we also want to have in here is the middleware. And we can actually copy over the middleware that we have in our settings.py file and then make a small change. So we copy over this middleware section, go to the deployment settings and paste it. And underneath the Django.middleware, we're going to be defining a new value. And this is going to be the link for white noise. And white noise will handle our static files. So in there, we state white noise with lowercase letters and then dot middleware. And I'm just going to copy over the word middleware to make sure that I don't make any mistakes. And then we do a dot and we need to do white noise, both with capitals. So white with a capital and noise with a capital. And then again, the word middleware. So let's copy that over. But also middleware needs to be with a capital. So it's white noise.middleware.white noise middleware. And we end that with a comma. So that will make sure the static files are going to be handled just fine. Now we also need to define the course allowed origins. Because you know that in our settings.py file, if we scroll down, we currently have listed our front-end URL to make sure that it can communicate with our backend code. So I'm just going to copy over this setting and put it in our deployment settings, but we will copy it out for now. Because later on we will specify the front-end URL right here, but we don't know that one yet. So we will revisit that later on. Next, we can also define storages. And storages will define how we will store the static files and also where. So we do storages and then an is sign, and then we open some square brackets. And in here, we are going to define two things. The first thing we define is a default, and that default is just going to be with a colon and then some squirrely brackets. And in here, we need to specify in capitals and within parentheses backend and then a colon. And then we state django.core.files.storage.file system storage. And make sure that file, system, and storage on the latter part are in capitals. So this is the default way that we will handle storage. However, after this squirrely bracket right here for default, we also are going to add something for static files. Because our static files are going to be served with white noise, so we need to let it know that if it's about static files, then white noise will handle this stuff. So after static files, we again do some colon like this, and then some squarely brackets, And also in there, we define the word backend in capitals, do a colon, and then we state that it's going to be handled by white noise dot storage dot compressed with capital, static with a capital, files with a capital, and then storage with a capital. And then end it with a comma as well, and also a comma after the static files part. So it's white noise dot storage, and then compressed with a capital, static with a capital, files with a capital, and storage with a capital. And you can also just copy this over from my GitHub repository because this will be available right there. Okay, so this will make sure that the static files are handled correctly. Now the last thing I also need to put in here is the database, because we will be using the PostgreSQL database. So we can define databases and then do an is sign and then some squarely brackets. And in there we define the word default and then do some colon right here. And now we're going to be using DJ database URL, the package that we also imported on the top here, to set the database credentials. And the reason that I do that is that's also the way that the render documentation is handling it. So in the default part, we do DJ underscore database URL and then dot config. And then we open some round brackets. Now, DJ database URL wants us to provide a few inputs. And the first thing is default. And default is going to be equal to an environment variable, and that is os.environ.get, and then some square brackets. And then we say database underscore URL. And later on, when we get to the render part, we will also set a database URL in the environment variables and make sure that that is populated. Now, the next thing that we also need to specify right here is con underscore max underscore age, and that is going to be equal to 600. And this has to do something about the connection and about the way that it's going to be established. I'm just following along with the render documentation here, so that's the reason that I've put it in here. And that is actually the last part of the puzzle of our settings file. And just like this, we can save it and it is complete. Now, the third step of this video is actually telling our application when to use our settings.py file and when to use our deployment settings. Because I only want to use this set of deployment settings when we will actually be in the deployment. When we are on our local computer, I just want our app to take these settings because otherwise my app will not work. So to do that, we need to make changes to a few of the files. And that's going to be the ASGI, the WSGI, and the manage.py file. Because in this ASGI file, you can see that the default settings module is being defined as API.settings. But what we want to do right here is actually define that if we are in the deployment location, then we want to use our settings.py file, but override the settings that we have listed right here. If we are not in our deployment, then we want to be using our settings.py file. Now, luckily, it is quite easy to tell Django that is going to be the case. So on top of the part where we define the settings thing, we can create a new variable called settings module. And in here, we're going to make a conditional statement that will tell us when we're going to use what settings. So I'm saying right here that we want to use API.deployment underscore settings. And the reason that I state that is that we are in the API folder. So if you are in another folder, please change it. And then we want to use deployment underscore settings. If render underscore external underscore hostname in os.environ, and else I just want to use API.settings. Now, what this does, it is going to take a look whether the render underscore external underscore hostname is present in the environment variables list. Because if you remember from our deployment settings, I mentioned that it's going to set this render external hostname by default when we deploy. So that means that if we are on render, it will know that we have the render external hostname inside of the environment variables, and we need to use the API.deployment settings. However, if this environment variable does not exist, That means that we are on a local computer, so we want to make sure that we have the API.settings. Now the only thing we need to change here is then say that the default settings module is not equal to API.settings, but is equal to settings_module. And let's save that. Now we're going to make exactly the same change in the other files. So I can copy over these two lines and we're going to go to our WSGI file right here. And again, you can here see that we have the os.environment.setDefault. So I can just paste in this logic right here and then delete this one because we have it specified there already. And let's save that. And then we can also copy this over again and do the same thing in our manage.py file, because in there it also states the os.environment.setDefault, but that needs to be changed as well to the settings module based on whether we have this one or not. So let's save that. The next thing that we need to do is we need to generate a requirements.txt file. And a requirements.txt file is nothing else than just a list of all of the packages that we have used during the development of our application. So in my case, all of the packages I installed into my virtual environment. Now, generating this file is very easy. You need to go to your terminal and then make sure that we are in the backend folder and that we have virtual environment activated. And we can generate it with one simple command. And that command is python-m pip freeze and then a bigger than symbol and then requirements.txt and then do enter. And you will now see that a new file has appeared inside of my project called requirements.txt. And in there, it lists down all of the packages that I've used during the development. Now, important, please check that the packages that we have installed at the beginning of this video are in there because we will really need those. And you can see right here that I have GUnicorn, I have Psycop G2, I have the UVcorn, and also white noise in here, and also the DJ database URL. So in this case, it is completely okay. Now, one thing we need to change right here, and that is the backports.zoneInfo. Because when I tried this myself, it got an error because this package is actually not that compatible for the deployment that we're going to be doing. So what we need to do is we need to make a small adjustment. So after this, we can do a colon and then do Python_version and say that it needs to be below 3.9. And this will make sure that this thing right here is no longer an issue when we are going to be deploying this to render. So this simple adjustment will make sure that it actually works. So let's now save this change. And now our requirements.txt file is complete. Now we also need to add another file to our backend folder. So we're going to go to the highest level, which is our backend folder right here, and create a new file, which is going to be called build.sh. And this is actually a bash file, which is going to run a few commands when the application is actually being built by render. So the first thing we need to define on the top is set and then -o and then error exit. Now what this means is that when we encounter an error, we need to exit. Next, we also need to tell it to install all of the things from our requirements.txt file when we build our application. So in here we say pip install and then -r and then requirements.txt. And by doing this, it's going to look for our requirements.txt file and install all of the packages in here. Then we also need to make sure that all of the static files that we have in our application are stored in the static files folder. And that is something that we have defined in our settings.py file earlier in the static root, which is somewhere down here. So we need to put in a command that is going to collect all of the static files and put them in that location. And that command is python manage.py and then collect static. And then we need to do --no-input. Because usually when you run python manage.py collect static, it's going to ask us something in the terminal saying, are you sure, yes or no? But by doing no input, it's just going to do it. because when we build, it's just going to run this automatically, and there's no room for saying yes or no. Then the last thing that we also want to build in here is making sure that it does all of the database migrations when we build the app. Because every time we push our app, we don't want to manually migrate the database. We just want it to do that automatically. So we can do Python manage.py migrate. And it will make sure that database migrations are applied automatically. With the build.sh file completed, we only have a few more steps to focus on. And one of them is adding another file, and that is a .gitignore file. So let's add a new file and do .gitignore. Now, this file represents a list of all of the things that we don't want to take to GitHub when we transport this code to GitHub using Git. Because some of the things are completely irrelevant. For example, our database, there's no need for it to be on GitHub because we don't want that, and also we don't need it for our deployment. And there's other files in here as well, such as the PyCache, which has all of the caching for our application, which we don't want to take with us when we deploy because it can also cause mistakes. So in here, we list down everything we don't want to take to our deployment. Now, I've already done a few deployments before, and I found a very handy list which lists down all of the things that you typically don't want to take to the GitHub repository. So if I go to an old project of mine, and you can just go to my GitHub repository in the link in this description, I already have a gitignore file which covers most of these cases. So I'm going to copy over everything inside of this file, and then we can paste it in right here. And you can see already some of the things that it doesn't want to take is a virtual environment, which we also have in our project right here. And also SQLite databases. It has some other files which some people might use. I don't use all of these, but it's good to have them in here just in case. So let's save that as well. And those were actually all of the changes that we need to make to our project to make it fit for the deployment on render. Now, the last thing that I want to check is make sure that our application still runs on our local computer, because we've made quite some changes to the settings, and we've also told our project when to use a certain settings file and when not. So I want to make sure that on our local computer, we still see the desired output. So I'm going to start my server by doing Python manage.py and then run server. And right here, you can see that it still works fine. And it also even mentions that it uses the settings of API.settings. So that's quite nice. And when we open it, it still looks the same as it did before. And when I click it, I still see the data from my database. So everything seems to be working just fine. And that is actually all for this video. In this video, I showed you how you can change your Django backend code so that it's fit for a deployment on render. In the next video, we're going to make sure that our backend code is pushed to the GitHub repository so that we can later on deploy it on render. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.